I want to welcome you guys tonight. My name is Natalie Fritz, and I am the Archivist and Director of Collections Outreach and Social Media for the Clark County Historical Society. And for the past a little more than 2 years, we've been doing these virtual programs to share things from our collections, from our archives, share stories from the community, and to help people learn a little more about history. We always do these kind of in a laid-back format with where we allow people to jump in and share and give more information. So we'll have time for that tonight. But what we've been noticed and what we've been focusing on throughout as we move forward with collections is looking at where we have stories where we may not have all of the information. And we might have to go to out into the community and talk to other people to have them be the experts to kind of give us more information to help fill in these gaps that we might have in our collection. Because while we strive to collect all of Clark County's history and everything that representative of the community, we know that we have, smaller collections or maybe not much. And I know that while we have a large religion category in our archives and information like that, our box that we have specifically on the Jewish community, on any Jewish congregations, is a very thin, slimline box with not a lot of information in it. So while we may have a lot on all different Christian denominations for the most part, and different churches and things like that, we know that the Jewish community is something we don't have a lot of information on. So this is where we can make those connections to people in the community. And I know Jane, our director of our development officer, she helped connect us with Rabbi Cary Kozberg, who's with us tonight, to help us tell more of the story of Springfield's Jewish history and the different congregations that have been here in Springfield throughout the years. And Rabbi Kozberg is currently with Temple Sholom, and I know that's where he started his career after he was his ordination in the 70s, and he has come back to Springfield in the past several years. So he would have perspective even from different areas to provide. So we're happy to have him with us tonight to share some things that we do have in our collection. We were able to go through and scan the small amount that we have to share back with him, so he could gather some more information and help put together something to tell you a little bit more about Springfield's Jewish history. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you and let you.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
More.
Can everyone hear?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. As Natalie said, I'm currently the rabbi at Temple Sholom. I'm part-time. I'm going to talk about how the congregation has changed through the years. It's basically an older congregation. We used to have a very large Sunday school, as you will see. We have no kids of school age now. I was first the rabbi in 1970, from 1977 1980. That was my first pulpit. I went on to do other congregational work, campus ministry, long-term care chaplaincy, spent a couple years in Israel, and in 2015 was re-engaged to be the part-time rabbi at Temple Sholom. So this was really a good opportunity for me to find out more about Springfield's Jewish history in a more organized way. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Have a lot to share tonight, and I want to begin by giving a brief history of American Jewry in general, because I think it's important to have the context of how Springfield's Jewish community began and developed, because in many ways it is a microcosm of what happened in similar smaller communities, particularly throughout the Midwest and the South. The first Jews came to America in 1654. They arrived in what was New Amsterdam. It was 23 Jews who had come from Dutch Brazil. They were fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition. They were known as Jews of Sephardi background, which means their ancestry came from the Iberian Peninsula from Spain and Portugal. You may remember that in 1492, the year that Columbus sailed for what would be the New World, at the same time he was leaving, he saw boats of Jews leaving Spain. The same Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand that had given him permission and backing to set sail is the same same royal couple that expelled the Jews from Spain, and a couple of years later, those who had gone to Portugal were also expelled. So the late 15th century, early 16th century, and into the 17th century was pretty hard for the Jews in Europe. And so these 23 Jews came to the New World in 1654. It wasn't until much later, several decades, that the Jewish community of the New World, and more Jews were coming, saw its first rabbi. He came to, I believe, Barbados. There was a very large Jewish community in the islands, the Caribbean islands, and in the northern South American coast. In America, the first rabbi did not come until 1840. The Jews that had come in the colonial period fought in the Revolutionary War. We know of one particular man by the name of Chaim Solomon who gave a lot of money. He lived in Philadelphia, I believe, gave a lot of money to the revolutionary cause. And the Jewish community at the time of the revolution and right after was small, but very, very glad to be in the first nation in Jewish history where Jews could actually be a minority but practice their religion in freedom. And with that, I want to look at the first slide. This is the letter that George Washington wrote to the Jews of Rhode Island in response to their congratulating him on his being elected president and his inauguration. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from it. Besides the salutations and expressions of appreciation, he said, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more than toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness upon our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." Signed, George Washington. So we see that once the revolution had ended and America now was a country with protection of religion, guaranteed in the First Amendment, the Jewish community had a good place to start. In the 19th century, the early 19th century, most of the Jews who came to this country were from either Germany or Central Europe. They came because of what was happening in Europe, a lot of upheaval. And they came because they too heard, like so many people from other countries, heard of the promise of the New World. There was no real rabbinic leadership. The practice of Judaism at the time was pretty much grassroots. It was lay-led and lay-influence. And in America, from that time until today, identification as a Jew was purely voluntary. In Europe, Jewish communities had been cloistered off. usually by order of the government. They lived in ghettos, and they were self-governing. And in the Middle Ages, of course, one could not be what we call a nun today, N-O-N-E. You were either a Christian or a Jew in Christian lands, or a Muslim or a Jew in Muslim lands. And there were Jews that left the Jewish community and shall we say, went over to the other side. But in this country, one did not have to identify with any religious community. So religious affiliation was strictly, and is today, truly voluntary. There were people that tried to hide their Jewish background, sometimes going as far as changing their names. We know certainly that was the case among many Hollywood Hollywood actors in the early 20th century. And even with Sabbath observance, which is very, very important and obligatory in Jewish tradition, in this country, particularly because people had to work on Saturday, because at that time the stores were closed on Sunday, because that's when most Christians observe their Sabbath. Sabbath observance pretty well fell off, and Jews had to work on Saturday. Their identification as Americans and Jews was very much influenced by Enlightenment ideas of personal liberty and freedom and dignity of the individual. So it's basically saying that up until the 19th century, the practice of Judaism was pretty much a hodgepodge. People came to this country with various backgrounds of knowledge. There were people that served as prayer leader, as ritual slaughterer, as someone who circumcised male babies. And those religious leaders were pretty much jack of all trades, if you will. In 1824, in Charleston, South Carolina, the congregation there decided that it needed to reform its worship. Now, the reform movement had already begun in Germany in terms of kind of streamlining its worship. It wanted to become more decorous. It wanted to shed its, shall we say, Middle Eastern tones. And at this particular congregation in Charleston, which was named Beth Elohim, it was renamed the Reformed Society of Israelites. It introduced an organ, it introduced English as opposed to all Hebrew, and the service became very much abbreviated. And those were really the hallmarks of Reformed Jewish liturgy up to this point. Part of it being done in the vernacular of the country, sermons being delivered in the vernacular of the country, a more decorous service with organ, although not so much today. I'll talk about that later. But basically wanting to bring Jewish worship up to the modern times. At this time also, and I want to emphasize again that this community was recalled or renamed the Reformed Society of Israelites. Now, in the 19th century, the word Jew was very rarely used among many of these Jewish congregations. The first seminary, which is still in existence in Cincinnati and has branches other places, was called the Hebrew Union College. The newspaper in Cincinnati was called the American Israelite. The first umbrella organization of congregations was called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, because the word Jew and Jewish had very negative connotations. And Jews at the time believed that if they used the word Israelite or Hebrew, it connected them more with the Bible and somehow it would make them more acceptable to Protestants, particularly that lived here in America. In this same congregation in Charleston in around 1843, the rabbi there, in dedicating a new building, made this comment. He said, "This synagogue is our temple, this city our Jerusalem, this happy land our Palestine, and as our fathers defended with their lives that temple, that city, and that land, so will their sons defend this temple, this city, and this land." And he added, "America is now our Zion, and Washington our Jerusalem." Now, with that, this rabbi was basically saying that his congregation and others that would follow did not pray for the return to the Holy Land. They did not pray, as Orthodox Jews still do today. They did not pray for restoration of the temple and the sacrificial cult. By saying that his synagogue was now their temple, he began a practice which continues today of calling Reformed synagogues many times with the word temple. So for example, in Springfield, the name of the synagogue is Temple Sholom. It's a synagogue, but it's called the temple. And you'll find that in many, many cities around the country, where that's sort of a way of identifying the synagogue as Reform if its name begins with the word temple. There were other changes that came into American Jewish practice, particularly with the idea of reforming and making it more modern. As I said before, Hebrew was limited because most people didn't understand it, and they wanted to be able to understand the words they were saying in prayer. There were very conscious imitations of Protestant worship, including removing the head covering. Men did not wear head coverings for a while. There was organ music. And as we're going to see in just a bit from a slide showing a 1933 confirmation service, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. So all this background, I hope, is going to put the history of Springfield Jewry into context. Jews arrived in the Springfield area a little bit after the Civil War ended. They came to these shores mostly, as I said, from Germany and Central Europe. They began as peddlers of dry goods, going from small town to small town. Some of them became merchants. And as we know, those Jews that moved to the South, we know that there were actually Jews that served in the Confederate Army, maybe not so much in support of slavery, but certainly in support of states' rights. We know that in 1866, in August of that year, there were several individuals of German background that met to organize a congregation they would call Ohev Tzeduka, which means lovers of righteousness. Very soon, other Jewish men that lived in the vicinity would join them. And as long as they had a prayer quorum of 10 men, and I'll stress at that time it was 10 men, they were able to conduct full worship services. There's a condition in traditional Jewish life that without the prayer quorum, a minimum of 10, certain prayers cannot be said. So as long as there's a quorum of 10 men, and now in the non-Orthodox denominations, it's 10 people, including women, a full service can be done. The first synagogue, the first place of meeting, was in the Fullrath building, and the rent was $20 a year, which is remarkable. The location of the synagogue moved several times during the last quarter of the 1800s. In 1888, they began to talk about building a freestanding building, but they were not able to raise enough money. We really don't know exactly how the services there were conducted. As I say, it was probably a hodgepodge of traditional Hebrew services, along with some changes that people wanted to make it more accessible to non-Hebrew speakers. At the time, there was no rabbi to get guidance from, and there was certainly no religious movement, as there would be later on, Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, with which to identify. Lots were purchased at Ferncliff Cemetery, and they were added through the years. Today at Ferncliff, there's still a section, a Jewish section for members of the Reformed Synagogue, Temple Sholom, and there's also a section in a different part of the cemetery where members of the now defunct, more traditional congregation, Beth El, where those people were buried. In 1873, when Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise was organizing various synagogues in the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard to join his newly formed umbrella organization, it seems that the congregation here in Springfield, Ohev Tzedukah is what it was called, became a charter member and was accepted into membership on August the 7th, 1873. So with membership now in the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the congregation had access to rabbis who were ordained at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And we know that the first rabbi to serve the congregation was a student by the name of Henry Friedman. Now we know, as I'm going to show you a little bit later on with the list of rabbis who have served the congregation, in the early days, the late 1870s into the 1880s, what's interesting is those rabbis did not go by the title rabbi, they went by the title reverend. And again, that may have been because they were not comfortable being so open about the denomination they were representing. There was really a very conflicted, I would say, a very conflicted self-image. On the one hand, they wanted to be a light to the nations and be exemplars of biblical values and ethics and justice and mercy. On the other hand, they didn't want to seem too particularistic. So in the early days, at least, and it wasn't until 1889 that rabbis who served the congregation began to be called rabbi and not reverend. The duties of the congregational rabbi were always the same: to lead worship services, to visit the sick, bury the dead, make pastoral visits, and of course, to teach Sunday school or religious school. And the rabbis at the time were usually here for 1 to 3 years. They were usually coming right out of Cincinnati, as I said, and that was the case for many, many years. The congregation here in Springfield was pretty much a jumping off point to serving larger pulpits. In the early days, rabbinic salaries were anywhere from $300 to $500 a year. And when the congregation itself couldn't afford that, they had to do either without a rabbi and have various lay leaders lead the congregation, or they would have students coming from HUC on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. Okay, so could we have the next slide, please? This is notes taken, I think, from Zoe Johnson, who in 1939 was working for the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, doing research on different churches and houses of worship in the Springfield area. And I'm believing that this is about, the notes are about a meeting that took place in 1879. I don't think these are the original notes. Somehow she found this, and this is notes of the Hebrew Ladies Benevolent Society. You can see again, the name was Hebrew, not Jewish Ladies Benevolent Society of Springfield, Ohio. meeting on the 13th day of, I believe, April, was held for the purpose of organizing this organization. And it says Reverend David Greenbaum, the president, was present, and then a number of names of other women, with the purpose of helping the needy, attending to the sick, and assisting burying the dead. Okay. Recorded on July the 5th, 1879. Okay, so I believe that's one of the earliest minutes of any of the organizations that were in existence at the time. We're going to see something that's a little bit earlier. We know that there was a ladies' auxiliary later to become known as a sisterhood. As I said before, the congregation moved around from 1901 to 1918. It was located at the Union Block on Fountain Avenue. During the years of World War I, the congregation did not have a full-time rabbi. They brought in faculty from the seminary in Cincinnati, and they also brought in students. One of the most famous students was a student by the name of Joshua Liebman, who later on went on to write the book Peace of Mind in the 1940s, became a tremendous bestseller among Jews and non-Jews because it was one of the first attempts to combine a religious and a psychological perspective of the human condition. So in 1916, they finally were able to raise enough money at the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the congregation to build a building. And the $10,000 was pledged within a few minutes. Plans were drawn up by an architect, and in 1917, they laid the cornerstone. Next slide, please. So in 1918, this building on South Fountain Avenue was completed and dedicated. It was dedicated by Dr. Julian Morgenstern, who was a professor of Bible at the seminary in Cincinnati. And like many Reformed temples that were built at that time, this is classic. You can see the Moorish architecture in the front, the Stars of David on the front, the windows that were again reminiscent of Moorish architecture. At the time, the cost was about $42,000, and membership at the time was only about 44 families. But the congregation was very much a part of the Springfield religious community. At the time of the dedication, it was a big community event, and we know that there were many ministers from various churches who spoke at the dedication, which of course was a good sign and a sign of interfaith cooperation. The very first full-time rabbi hired was a rabbi by the name of Sidney Tedeschi. He came from Wichita, Kansas. The salary that year was $3,000. During the 1920s, membership in the temple grew to about 63 families. And they were able to reduce the debt from $21,000 to about $13,000 during the 1920s. Next slide, please. We know that during the 1920s, Springfield was a kind of a hotbed of Ku Klux Klan activity. Here's a picture of a Klan march in Springfield in 1923. We all know what the Klan did and still stands for. It was very anti-Black, anti-Catholic, and certainly anti-Semitic. It's interesting that in the 1920s, both the Reformed congregation and the Orthodox congregation changed their names to either an English name or a Hebrew name that was easier to pronounce for the benefit of non-Jews. In 1924, the temple's name, the temple, the building, was called the South Fountain Avenue Temple because that's where it was located. The congregation, however, retained its name of Ohev Tzedakah, lovers of righteousness. We're going to talk about the Orthodox Synagogue just a bit later. Now, even though Klan activity receded in Springfield, Springfield's Jews still experienced anti-Semitism well into the 1970s. It wasn't of the Klan type, but it was more quiet and, shall we say, more genteel. One of our late members, Fred Leventhal, who was very prominent in Springfield civic life and Springfield politics, told me shortly before he passed away a couple of years ago that when he moved to Springfield from Cleveland in the late 1940s, he was approached by a new neighbor after he bought his house. He was approached by a new neighbor who wanted to buy his house. The neighbor wanted to buy his house from him, and when Fred asked him why he wanted to buy his house, the neighbor said because he didn't want to live next door to a Jew. And that was sort of a cold wind blowing in Fred's face. We also know that until the 1970s, membership in the Springfield Country Club was also restricted and did not allow Jews to belong. And that was well into the 1970s when they changed their policy. If we could have slides 7, 8, and 9. This is the confirmation service I was talking about a few minutes ago. 1933. You see that there's nothing really specifically Jewish about it. There's a poem from Yehuda Halevi, who was a medieval Jewish poet. We have the next slide. Here we see the order of the service. And if you look at it closely, there's not much, except for maybe no references to Jesus. There's not much that really stands out or differs from a Protestant service. It was very decorous. The music was orchestrated in terms of what was being sung, what was being played, again, on an organ, and very, very different from a traditional, that is Orthodox or even a conservative prayer service. Very, very little Hebrew, maybe 1 or 2 lines, mostly all in English. And the confirmation service was done including both boys and girls to confirm their commitment to Judaism. Confirmation in the early days of the Reform movement replaced bar mitzvah because at that time there was no bat mitzvah ceremony for girls. And instead of just creating a service for girls, they got rid of the service for boys and created something that was, shall we say, egalitarian. There wasn't much going on in the 1930s because of the Depression. Here you see congregational staff and officers, people who were very, very active in the congregation. You'll also see that the musicians, Mrs. Hanford, Mr. Nicholas, Mr. Patterson, Professor Humberger, were not Jews, okay? And in most congregations, Reformed congregations at that time, the musicians and the choir were hired not because of their affiliation with the synagogue, but because of their professional expertise. It was very important for people to have a pleasant aesthetic experience. And therefore, Reformed congregations, I think even to this day, have no qualms about hiring and having non-Jews provide the musical accompaniment.
Rabbi?
Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Rob Zeitzman. My family goes back to the 1920s in Springfield, Ohio. And it's just interesting to see Martin Ebner, David Krause. I remember, I still know Phil Krause, which would be David Krause's grandson, I think.
Right, and his brother Rick belongs to the congregation.
Oh yeah. So, but it's just interesting to see Ebner. And of course there was a tragedy with one of the Ebners in the beating. And of course, one of the Ebners went on to play pro football. But it's I'm in San Diego, so but I just wanted to jump in. It's just interesting for me to see these names, and I do remember probably as maybe as a 5-year-old or so, 6-year-old, going to that South Fountain Avenue temple. Anyway, thank you.
Well, you must have been. Were you in the dedication of the new building?
Oh, our family probably was. Alex.
Okay, well, you're going to see some more familiar names then.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, I was there. I was bar mitzvahed in 1966 by the late Rabbi Helfgott of blessed memory, and etc.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Thank you. Now, I think we're going to skip to slides 17 and 18. Next one. Okay, thank you. Okay, this is Rabbi Jacob Polish. He became rabbi in 1939 after Rabbi Josephson left. When the war broke out, he joined the chaplaincy corps of the U.S. Navy. There were several people from the Jewish community that served in the armed forces. Next slide, please. One of them was Lieutenant Robert Lee Levine. This is a breastplate on a Torah scroll that we still have in our synagogue, and it was dedicated by his family in memory of him, in memory of Robert Lee Levine, or Levine. He was Martin Levine's brother, who gave his life for his country July 31st, 1944. This was dedicated by his parents, Isaac and Pearl Levine. Pearl, I remember, was still alive when I served the congregation back in the 70s. Okay, so we're going on to the post-war period. Like in many cities, particularly in many small towns, the Jewish population of those communities grew significantly. In 1953, the school had 63 children. In 1956, it had 90 children. At that time, temple membership was about 141 people, 141 families, and the sisterhood had 120 members. So the congregation, the building on South Fountain, was no longer meeting its needs. Originally, they purchased a building or rented a building near the South Fountain Avenue building to accommodate religious school. But in 1955, they began a campaign to build a new building. And in 1956, there was a groundbreaking for the educational building that stands to this day on limestone. And in the summer of that year, there was a Cornerstone dedication. Okay, now we're going to go on to several slides from that time. Slide 19. This was the dedication of the educational building in 1956. The cover of the booklet that was made. Next slide, please. Here you see the program. The governor was there. Members of different rabbis from different congregations was there. The president of Wittenberg College was there. It was broadcast on the radio, which I thought was very, very significant. And it was a big deal. in 1956, this particular dedication was a big deal. They came, and there was even Congressman Brown, who was our congressman at the time, appeared. Next slide, please. These are the people that were there. Cornerstone Dedication. This was before the dedication of the building itself. The Cornerstone Dedication with Rabbi Diamond is shown here, with a photograph of most of the congregation who were there at the time, adults and children alike. Next slide. This is the list of members. Okay, now when you think of the fact that today the congregation has about 25 households, okay, you can understand how dramatically the membership has decreased, but nevertheless, we're still pretty strong in our desire to keep the place alive. In the 1950s, when Springfield's economy was very, very different and set up very differently, we see that there was and this is just the membership of the temple, not even the Orthodox Synagogue. So at the time in the 50s, Springfield had a fairly healthy Jewish community. Next slide. This is a list of the children, and the ones that are starred are individuals who are still around in the area. They're still living in the area that I know of. Next slide. This is the board. The gentleman on the left in the sunglasses is Rabbi Diamond, and some of the names I would imagine some of you will remember. Next slide. Sisterhood, very, very active sisterhood. As I said, at that time there was about 120 members, and this was the board. This was a time when women were not yet rabbis. Their participation on the pulpit was pretty much non-existent, but women were very, very active in, shall we say, auxiliary type of activities to keep the synagogue financially healthy and socially active. And that was the case, in most synagogues around the country. Next slide. The kids in the Sunday school and the Sunday school teachers. And again, thinking that we don't have any children of school age from kindergarten up to high school, again, we see how dramatically things have changed. Next slide. This was a youth group. The kids at the picture of the kids at the top were the teenagers, I believe, and the kids at the bottom were the in-betweens. Next slide. Here are greetings, one from President Eisenhower and another from Dave Hobson, who honored us at the 125th anniversary. I want to note that in 1959, the name of the congregation was formally changed from Ohev Tzedukah, Lovers of Righteousness, to Temple Sholom. And again, I believe it's because it was just easier to refer to. It didn't lend itself to mispronunciation like Ohev Tzedukah would. And again, it reflected a desire of members to make it easier for non-Jews to identify with. Next slide. Here we have some advertisements, greetings, best wishes from various businesses in the community at the time of the 1956 dedication. You may remember some of these names. Unfortunately, most of them are no longer in existence. Next slide. Next slide. Ben Brooke and Jack Schechter were members of the congregation, so it's appropriate that they send good wishes to their own congregation. Next slide. Okay, so here is the current facility. Not just the educational wing, which is on the right side, but also the offices and the sanctuary, which is on the left side of the building. From 1966 to 1992, there were not a lot of changes. Beginning in the 70s, there were a lot of changes. Can we see the next slide, please? Okay. And the next slide. Here we have membership of the 1992, during the 1992 dedication. Again, it's smaller than it was in 1956, but nevertheless, it was still a healthy congregation. People already knew that the congregation was aging. A lot of these people that are noted here were already well into their 70s, even their 80s. Next slide. And greetings from the president and from the mayor and the Clark County Board of Commissioners on the 125th anniversary of the congregation. Next slide. Again, greetings. Binding Broom was owned at the time by Fred and Harry Leventhal, and of course the Levine Realty company. At the time, Martin was still, I believe, with us, but that company is still around. Okay, I want to talk about the changes that were happening in the Reform movement, and which Temple Sholom was confronting as well. I mentioned before that one of the changes in the 60s and 70s in the Reform movement was that women began to have a bigger role in the congregation. Girls started to become bat mitzvahed as boys were becoming bar mitzvahed. Women began to read actually from the Torah scroll. They began to conduct services. Beginning in 1995, Temple Sholom would have 2 women rabbis, Rabbi Mariana Gewirtz, who tragically passed away from cancer in the, I believe it's 2005 or so. And then she was followed by Rabbis Janice Garfunkel. Women began to not only serve on the temple board, but also be elected to positions of authority. We've had our our 4th woman president currently. Lori Leventhal has been serving as president of our congregation for over a decade. The rabbis of the congregation always participated in events in the community, serving on civic boards and community boards. Temple Sholom was one of the pioneers of the annual interfaith Thanksgiving service. And when we had such a thing called Brotherhood Week, the temple was always open to members of other churches, and the rabbi and congregants would explain various ritual objects and talk about services. What you see is a picture of 3 different Reform prayer books. Going from left to right, they're in chronological order. The first one, called the Union Prayer Book, was the prayer book that was originally the original American Reform prayer book. Lots of English, very little Hebrew, English renditions that again were quite Protestant. You can see how small and how narrow it is. That was replaced by the new Union prayer book called the Gates of Prayer in the 1970s. You can see, obviously, there's a big difference in thickness, in height, and therefore in weight. And I will tell you that in the mid-1970s, Temple Sholom switched from the Union Prayer Book to the New Union Prayer Book. And I was not rabbi then when they switched, but I will tell you that I got the backlash when I started in the 1970s. I remember very clearly a member of the congregation who had been a member for a very long time. 2 weeks after I had come to work in 1977, she wanted to meet with me. And she was a lady at the time, I think in her late 50s, early 60s, and I was all of 27 years old. And she said, "Rabbi, I want you to know I'm not happy about this new prayer book." Now, the prayer book had been in use already for over a year. There was a lot of grousing about it, and she wanted to let me know that she was one of the people grousing about it. She said, "I was raised with the Union Prayer Book. I'm comfortable with the Union Prayer Book. I don't like all this addition of all this Hebrew. We're becoming more Orthodox, and I don't like it." And I said to her, I won't mention her name, I said, "Thank you for your concern. I certainly understand where you're coming from. I certainly understand that the change has been hard for you. And I will try to be as sensitive as I can to any other changes that might come along." Now, there were other changes. One of the other changes was rabbis started to wear yarmulkes, and I happen to be one of them. Okay, reclaiming the head covering was something that the Reform movement was just beginning. It's always been optional that men wear, well, optional from the 1970s that men wear, cover their heads. Before the 70s, it was pretty much forbidden in Reform synagogues for men to cover their heads. And actually, men were asked in several Reform congregations across the country, if they came in with head coverings, they were asked to remove their head coverings. If they didn't, they would be asked to leave. So that was a hallmark of what we call classical Reform Judaism. The prayer book on the right is the prayer book we are currently using for the Sabbath. It's called Mishkan Tefillah. It's not as thick because this is only for the Sabbath. Okay, the bigger prayer book that has all of the prayers for weekday and holidays is as thick as the New Union prayer book and taller, so it's even heavier. And we don't use that prayer book as often as we do the Shabbat. Some of the other changes that took place was that organ music was replaced by guitar music. I know that guitar was introduced to worship by some of the youth group members back in the 60s and 70s. I happen to play guitar, and I guess I was the first guitar playing rabbi the temple has had. And I still do it in my worship. 40 years later, it's not as revolutionary as it was when it started, but it's actually become pretty common in Reformed congregations, to the point of some people believing that you couldn't become a Reformed rabbi if you didn't play the guitar. That's how widespread it's been.
Hey, Rabbi?
Yeah.
Just want to jump in. So, I had my bar mitzvah in 1966 with the Union Prayer Book. And I left Springfield in 1977, 78. Rabbi Aaron Rosenberg, I think it was Rosenberg.
Yeah, he was the one that brought in the gates of prayer.
So that's the last one I remember. But between like 1977 and mid 1980s, when we had children, and we started going back to a synagogue here in San Diego, and it's like, what is this? It's like, has Reformed Judaism become, like conservative, or
That's an excellent question.
It's like, what happened?
That's an excellent question.
And so anyway, I'm gonna have to head home. It's almost 5 o'clock here, but I'm gonna have to head home. But is this being recorded? Is this gonna be available?
I believe it is. I'm seeing something that says, yes, it's being recorded.
Yeah, and so if there's a way I could get a link to it, my mother is still alive. She's in Tampa, and I think there's other family that would enjoy some of this
Sure.
perspective.
We'll
It's
try to get
being
it to-
recorded, so we can absolutely get you a copy.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. I really would. All right.
Super.
No problem.
Thank you very, very much for doing this. It's really interesting.
Sure. Thanks for your input. Appreciate it.
Yeah, real quickly, the Rabbi Emeritus now here in San Diego at Temple Emmanuel, where we're members, is Rabbi Martin S. Lawson. And Rabbi Lawson told me a brief story once I joined the synagogue. He says, well, he said, when I was finishing at the HUC in Cincinnati, I went to Springfield, and they were supposedly looking for an assistant rabbi or something, or an educator. And Rabbi Helfgott was there, and Rabbi Lawson has a very good voice. Initially, he thought he was going to be a cantor, but he became a rabbi.
Right.
And Rabbi Helfgott listened to him, and he was, he sang, chanted some prayers, and he said, "Go away, we don't need a cantor." So anyway,
Well, yeah.
So I still.
Well, if you see Rabbi Lawson, tell him I said hi. I was in school with him.
Oh yeah, he
please
just performed. He just performed in October. He performed the wedding ceremony for my son and daughter-in-law. So and he did my daughter 5 years ago. So anyway, yeah, I love, great guy. All right, thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Want to talk about some more of the other changes. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, this is a photo of the original sanctuary on the bottom and the ark on the left. Okay. It looks pretty much that way today. Very, very not ornate. The Hebrew letter Shin in the back of the ark represents the word Shalom. Obviously, the tree is the tree of life. The 5 books are the 5 books of Moses. For us, a tree is a metaphor for Torah, tree of life. And then the 5 planks or boards on either side are the 10 commandments, 5 and 5. And then on the lower photograph on the right, you see the menorah, a representation of the candelabrum that stood in the original temple in Jerusalem in biblical times. And on the left is the American flag. Okay, now can we have the next slide? Same sanctuary, but there's a difference. And the difference is that next to the menorah on the right is the Israeli flag, okay, which was not in the sanctuary of Temple Sholom until about 4 years ago. Now, the state of Israel was created in 1948 in many synagogues to show support of Israel. In the sanctuary, you will have the American flag and the Israeli flag. Now, for many decades, the leadership of Temple Sholom did not want an Israeli flag in the pulpit, rather in the sanctuary. There were many discussions at board meetings. I happened to be at one of them. It was never supported because of memories of the Klan and the suspicion or the fear that having an Israeli flag would open up members to accusations of dual loyalty. Those people who fought it, again, it was kind of a generational thing. They're no longer with us. The issue was brought to the congregation once again in, I believe, 2017 or 2018. And at that time, it was overwhelmingly affirmed that we needed to have an Israeli flag. So that issue kind of went away, and is not really discussed anymore. It's a given that Temple Sholom is a supporter of Israel. Next slide. Okay, here is a story from 1979, I believe, when I was rabbi. This is a story of a scribe who came in from New York to repair our Torah scrolls. And since we don't have too many scribes who repair Torah scrolls coming to Springfield, it was newsworthy, and it's part of the archives now. Next slide. This is a picture of Rabbi Gewirtz with one of the Torah scrolls, telling giving the story about the significance of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. You can see better the 10 Commandments going from right to left is the first through the 10th in the original Hebrew. Next slide. And here's a list of the rabbis who have served to the best of our knowledge. You can see that the first several, as I said before, are called reverend and not rabbi. They had rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College, but they preferred to be called reverend. And I tried to fill in the missing names at the bottom on the right side. You'll see there were years where there were no rabbis. There were years when there were students. Up to today. Unfortunately, Rabbi Goldman, who served from 83 to 95, actually passed away last week in Cleveland. Next slide. Okay, very quickly, we're going to go through. This is the original charter, everyone, that hangs in our building. This is the original charter of the original Orthodox synagogue, which name was Chesed Shel Emet, which means true righteousness. And you can see it was handwritten. This is the charter that was dated July, I believe, 30th, 1887. Okay. Now, as I said before, there were already Jewish people living in Springfield. The congregation, the Temple congregation, the Reformed congregation, was already a going concern. But this congregation was started by Jews from Eastern Europe. Eastern European Jewry started to come to this country en masse in the 1880s into the 1920s. And their preference of Jewish practice was much more traditional. They did not experience in Europe the enlightenment that German Jewry did. So even though they wanted to become American, when it came to being Jewish, they preferred the traditional ways. Okay, and so the temple at the time was not going to meet their religious needs, and they felt the need to begin a new congregation. Next slide. Okay, and here is, again, Zoe Johnson's work, telling us a bit about the congregation, telling us where people came from, where the building was. A little bit hard to read, but it again, this is documented in the archives of the Historical Society. A lot of details about where the building was, what property was purchased, how big it was, what the cost was. We'll see that the building on let's see, King's, the north property, was in use until 1928. Most of the rabbis that served at this time were not American born. They were born in Europe, came to this country, which means they probably spoke Yiddish as their first language, English as their second language, which was pretty typical. Next slide. Okay, the left side talks about, again, the Beth El Ladies Aid Society, why it came into existence, the fact that it purchased land for cemetery plots in Ferncliff. It also says that a lot of the records of this congregation were lost. On the next side, the right side on page 4, as it says, tells of some of the rabbis who did serve, as well as names of the people, the men particularly, who were connected with the origin and survival of the congregation. It says that in 1939, at the age of 83, one of the original members, Nathan Ebner, who's as Mr. Zeitzman was on the Zoom call, reminded us, Ebner is still a very, very prominent name within the Springfield community, and Nathan Ebner was the patriarch who helped start the Orthodox Synagogue. Next slide. Okay, more about the members, and actually about the worship schedule. It was, as it says, always in Hebrew, no English. Services were at 6:30 p.m. Usually the services for the temple began at 8 o'clock. Okay, they were late Friday night services was a specific innovation of American Reform Judaism. It was believed that men would come home, have dinner with their families, and then go to synagogue at 8 o'clock. A traditional service usually was much earlier, usually around sunset. This particular congregation had regular services at 6:30, and then also, as you'll see, also had Saturday morning services at 9 a.m., which traditionally is the main service of the week. And then, of course, the rabbi, in this case, Rabbi Rosenberg, it says conducted religious school during the week for 2 hours, teaching Hebrew and the Torah and sacred history. Next slide. Again, more of the same from Zoe Johnson doing her works progress administration work. Next slide. Notes that she took about that, which she actually transferred onto the official forms. Next slide. Okay, now this is, I'm not sure how this came into the archive, but I wanted to talk about this. This is a advertisement for Passover at a Jewish resort in Atlantic City, okay, which was very, very popular. It still is for some people. You'll notice that the accommodations was $35 a week per person with meals. This was very popular because when Passover comes, Jews have to clean their kitchens. They have to make get rid of all their everyday silverware and plates and bowls, and bring in something, a totally different set of flatware and plates and bowls for Passover. Food has to be changed. So a lot of people, instead of doing that for the hassle, they would just lock up their house and spend the week at a resort. So you see that there was always traditional Passover seders, first and second night. It says the Sidorim in the main dining room. There was always a cantor with a choir, and the food was strictly kosher under the supervision of the rabbis on the left, Rabbi Leventhal and Rabbi Leo Jung, both of whom I might add were very, very prominent rabbis in the Orthodox community in the 30s. Okay, so this is an advertisement for that particular resort offering its Passover program. Next slide. Okay, this is a memorial plaque that hangs in the temple's hallway, along with important documents important to Temple Sholom. But we also, since Bethel Synagogue folded after it sold its building in the, I believe in the late 50s, early 60s, it began to rent rooms in the temple. Its congregation shrank from 100 to about 10 within a 30-year period. And eventually it disappeared, and we have its memorabilia. The Torah scroll that it had, it actually sold to a congregation in Springfield, Virginia. I guess they wanted to keep the Springfield connection. Okay. We have people who were members of the congregation. It was very common for Jews in Springfield to have dual membership. People would belong to the Orthodox Synagogue and also to the Reformed Temple. Usually it was only going from the Orthodox Synagogue to the Reformed Temple, not vice versa, because they wanted to, the people who joined the temple from the synagogue wanted to remain members at the synagogue for sentimental and family reasons. I believe that's the last slide. Yeah. Okay, I've given you a whole lot of information, so I just want to open it up to questions.
Well, I just want to thank you for all that wonderful information. And I took a lot of notes that I'm going to put into the archives myself. See, Jane did as well. But I see that Arlene has a question. She's raised her hand over there. So if you're unmuted, you can go ahead.
Hi, my name is Arlene, and my maiden name was Rubinoff. I saw the name on several of the documents and on the plaque, and was married in Temple Sholom in '67. And I joined the Zoom call late, and I would love to have a copy of the site where I can view the entire presentation, and also to show it to my sister, who still lives in Springfield.
Who's your sister?
Her name now is Sandy Williams.
Okay.
She took over my dad's real estate business, and it was called Spotlight Realty. Hers was. His was obviously Rubinoff Realty. But my grandfather, Lewis, had a dry goods store on Main Street. But when he came over from Russia, he had a cart, and my grandmother sewed aprons and other things, and he would walk around and sell them.
He's the poster child, just like my grandfather did. That was a very familiar story.
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't join in the beginning, so I'm looking forward to getting a copy.
Well, yeah, it was recorded, so you'll be able to hear the whole thing.
It'll be on the Facebook page for the Heritage Center and on YouTube, but we can also send a direct email to everybody who was registered for this, so you'll get it there as well.
Great. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
We have a question from Donna, who asked where the closest Orthodox congregation is.
The closest Orthodox congregation, there is one, I believe, in Dayton, and of course in Columbus. There's several. A lot of the small congregations in the area, like in Mansfield and Lima, and other places, are basically dealing with what we're dealing with. We're about 25 families, but we're, as I said before at the beginning, we're very, very active. On any given Friday night, we'll have anywhere from 10 to 18 people, which is proportionally over half the congregation. And I promise you, there's no Reformed synagogue in this country that gets half the congregation on a Friday night. So I'm pretty happy with what we're doing.
Do you have services on Saturday?
We do not have service on Saturday. That we've never had services on Saturday except when there's been a bar bat mitzvah. That was always the case, I think, with this particular congregation.
Right.
Friday night was always the was always the main worship time. And that again was one of the differences between the Orthodox congregation Bethel, which later became conservative. I didn't mention that, but later became conservative. It was one of the differences between that congregation and Temple Sholom.
Interesting.
What's the difference between a Orthodox and a conservative?
Well, today the difference is quite significant. Orthodox congregations have separate seating for men and women. Women are not part of the leading the service. They are in conservative now. Most conservative synagogues do not have mixed seating. There are women rabbis who are conservative. There are no Orthodox rabbis who are, I'm sorry. There are women rabbis who are conservative rabbis. There are no women rabbis that are Orthodox rabbis.
Mm.
Anybody else?
Well, I say oh, go ahead, Jane.
I was going to say that with the move to incorporate more Hebrew, has some of the language changed in addition to that? So you mentioned reverends, going back to using the word rabbi. Has there been kind of other like vocabulary changes alongside
there have. I mean, thanks
Hebrew?
for bringing that up, Jane. Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. In current Reform usage, particularly in this prayer book, which is the current one we're using, the Reform movement has made references to God in English. They do not use a third person pronoun. Okay, it's gender sensitive. Okay, so they will only use either second person to refer to you. They'll never say he or she. And when a pronoun would be used in the third person, it's never a pronoun, it's always a God.
Hashem.
Now that's something that the Reform movement and some of the other non-Orthodox movements are doing. The problem is that the Hebrew remains the same. The Hebrew is a gendered language, and references to God in Hebrew are always in the masculine, and that's a separate presentation. But on the one hand, if people are saying the Hebrew, they're actually they're using gendered language. When they're saying the English, they're not. So some people say it's kind of a disconnect, because in some ways you're saying, well, Hebrew is not really a language, it's just a bunch of sounds we make, but the real language is English, and when we refer to God, we don't want to use he or she. And again, that's another discussion for another time.
I don't know whether you addressed it earlier or not, but one of the Torahs was donated to Camp Livingston in Cincinnati, now in Indiana.
Oh, one of the Bethel Torahs?
One of the one of the Bethel Torahs.
Yeah, it must have been the temple, because the three Torahs we have are still the Torah that had the newspaper article about the scribe fixing the Torah, repairing it. That Torah was actually brought to this country when the congregation began, so it goes back to 1866.
Oh, okay.
And we still use it every Friday night. Of the three Torah scrolls we have, it's the lightest. The other two weigh probably about 40 pounds each.
Wow.
And so we leave those respectfully in the ark and use the smaller one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Diana Seaman. I just want to say thank you.
Hi, Diane. You're more than welcome.
I didn't want to cry, but excuse me, brought back a lot of memories.
I hope I did it honorably.
You did. And the picture that was in the paper, I recognized people in that picture. In fact, I think my sister was in the front row of that picture.
Mm-hmm.
So that was fun to see. I was there when Rabbi Diamond was there. My father passed away in 1956 when I was 6 years old. So even though I continued to attend Sunday school, I was never confirmed. But I definitely enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. I
seeing
appreciate
things from back
that.
then.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say that it was really neat for me, who has done a lot of research just on local businesses and people and places, that I've never made connections even as to what, you know, religious community anyone's a part of, but to see so many names that I recognized as, oh, hey, I know which store they ran, or, you know, I remember,
Yeah.
I remember them from other research that I have done, like Percy Rosenfeld
Right.
Jr. that we've, you know, talked about so much, you know, he was so many people know him from downtown and his
Right.
radio commercials and things like that. A lot of connections that I never made, just doing general research. It shows just how much
Right.
of the community that well, that not everybody thinks about. I know that recently we had done we had interviewed somebody, Jim Patsiavos, and learned so much about the Greek community. And I had the same kind of revelations talking to him of all of the, oh, of course that's a
Right,
Greek name.
right.
You know, things that just research that you know, things we have in our collections, and just how much of different aspects of the community that we have
Yeah,
in our county and in Springfield.
The ethnic groups that came from overseas to this country, I think, you know, back in the day, all wanted to try to retain their own cultures, but they wanted to be American, and they really wanted to assimilate, and some more than others. There were some people, particularly because Jews have been persecuted for so many years in so many places. This was the first, United States is literally the first country not governed by Jews, where Jews could live as Jews without anybody bothering them on a wide scale or even government sponsored basis. And so it was like a kid in a candy store. Okay. Some of you I know are familiar with the play Fiddler on the Roof, about Jews who, you know, were in a traditional Orthodox Jews living in a shtetl who had to leave because of persecutions from the Tsar's army. And many of them are going to America. And one of them says, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to America." Now, that's a very, very, very poignant statement, because that's exactly what happened with a lot of Jews that came to this country. Okay, they threw off everything and wanted to become American. Others who, and there was everybody in, you know, in between. There were people who didn't throw off anything, and, you know, they're still around today. The people Jews who wear, you know, long beards, side locks, black hats. They live in pretty much cloistered communities in New York and Chicago and Baltimore. And then there's everyone in between, people who live very, very traditional lives at home, but when they're out in public, you wouldn't know that they're Jewish. And then there are other Jews who want to only be American and you know, participate in American life. And for them, any connection to Jewish tradition or Jewish life is maybe a memory or just ethnic.
Rabbi,
Uh-huh.
this is Arlene Rubinoff again, and I wondered who's taking care of the cemetery arrangements for the Jewish community. My uncle Sam Friedman did before.
Oh yeah. I believe it's Larry Schneider now, and we're it's being taken care of. That's a pretty important part of what we do, actually. Unfortunately, we found out from Ferncliff that the Jewish sections, the plots, a lot of the Jewish sections are full, And the couple of funerals we've had in the last year or so, people have had to be buried elsewhere in the cemetery, but not in the Jewish sections.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Mhm.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us tonight and sharing
You're welcome.
all of this information. And again, this will be recorded, so people will be able to watch it now, to watch it later. This is kind of, a time capsule of local Jewish history that people will be able to access and learn from. So thank you for helping us create this resource that,
You're welcome. Thanks for
that
having
people
me.
will have. So thank you so much. And thank you guys for
Okay.
joining tonight. We'll keep you posted on future virtual endeavors, but we may be taking a bit of the summer off, but we'll let you know when we have our any next themes that we'll be talking about. So
Great. Thank you.
good to see you, and thank you.
Thank
for
you.
doing this.
Natalie, Natalie and Jane, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate you. You guys have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.